Hey guys, welcome back to the Atlas Archives, where tonight we're venturing to West Africa's most surprising success story, Ghana, a country that somehow managed to turn centuries of being called the Gold Coast into actually becoming golden at democracy. While other nations were still figuring out how to hold elections without things getting dramatically complicated, Ghana was quietly perfecting the art of peaceful power transfers, like it was some sort of political ballet. Tonight, we'll explore how this relatively small nation became Africa's democratic darling, why its geography reads like a textbook on how to have every climate zone in one country, and how a place once known primarily for exporting cocoa and gold somehow ended up exporting something far more valuable, hope. So grab your favourite evening beverage, find that perfect spot where your pillow meets your curiosity, and let's discover why Ghana might just be the most quietly remarkable country you've never given enough thought to. Chapter 1: Ancient Foundations and Early Kingdoms. Long before European ships appeared on the horizon like uninvited dinner guests, the land we now call Ghana was home to sophisticated societies that would make modern urban planners weep with envy. These weren't scattered villages playing historical hide-and-seek. These were complex, organised communities with trade networks that stretched across the Sahara like an ancient version of Amazon Prime, though delivery times were measured in months rather than days. The earliest inhabitants of this region were likely the ancestors of modern-day ethnic groups, including the Guan people, who settled in the area around the first millennium BCE. Picture, if you will, these early settlers looking around at the lush forests, abundant rivers, and rich soils, and thinking something along the lines of, well, this beats wandering around the desert. They established agricultural communities along the major rivers, the Volta, the Pra, and the Ankobra, creating the foundation for what would become one of West Africa's most prosperous regions. But here's where our story takes an interesting turn, like a plot twist in a historical novel that nobody saw coming. The name Ghana itself comes from an empire that was actually located several hundred miles to the northwest, in what is now Mali, Senegal, and Mauritania. The ancient Ghana Empire, which flourished from roughly the 6th to the 13th centuries CE, was so famous for its wealth and power that when the modern nation gained independence in 1957, its leaders decided to adopt the name as a tribute to African greatness. It's rather like naming your new restaurant Rome because you admire Italian cuisine, even though you're located in Nebraska. The real ancient Ghana Empire, sometimes called Ouagadougou by its own people, controlled the gold and salt trade routes that crisscrossed the Sahara. Salt, believe it or not, was once so valuable that it was literally worth its weight in gold. Imagine explaining to your modern dinner guests that the seasoning on their French fries was once considered a luxury item worthy of kings. The empire's capital, Kumbi Saleh, was described by medieval Arab geographers as a magnificent city where the king lived in a palace decorated with sculptures and windows of glass, which, in the 11th century, was about as impressive as having a Tesla in your driveway today. Meanwhile, back in the forests and savannas of what would become modern Ghana, local societies were developing their own impressive civilizations. Archaeological evidence suggests that ironworking technology arrived in the region around the 4th century BCE, brought by migrants and traders from the north. Iron tools revolutionized agriculture and warfare, much like how the invention of the coffee machine revolutionized Monday mornings. With better tools came better farming, and with better farming came population growth and the ability to support specialized crafts and trade. The most significant early development in the region was the emergence of the Bono state in the 11th century CE. Located in what is now the Brong-Ahafo region, Bono was strategically positioned to control trade routes between the forest kingdoms to the south and the savanna empires to the north. The Bono people were among the first in the region to mine and trade gold systematically, establishing mining operations that would continue for centuries. They also developed a sophisticated political system with a paramount chief known as the Bono Hine, who ruled over various sub-chiefs in a hierarchy that balanced central authority with local autonomy. Gold mining in ancient Ghana, the geographical region, not the empire, was both an art and a science. Miners used ingenious techniques to extract gold from both surface deposits and underground veins. They created elaborate systems of tunnels and shafts, some extending deep into the earth, supported by wooden frameworks that would impress modern engineers. The gold was so abundant and the mining techniques so advanced that Arab geographers of the medieval period wrote about the region as if it were El Dorado, which, coincidentally, is exactly how European explorers would later view it. The trans-Saharan trade networks that connected West Africa to North Africa and beyond were like ancient superhighways, except the trucks were camels and the rest stops were oasis towns. These trade routes carried far more than just gold and salt. Ideas, technologies, religions, and cultural practices flowed along these paths like water through carefully engineered channels. Islam gradually spread into the region through these commercial contacts, initially taking hold among traders and urban elites, before slowly influencing broader society. By the 13th century, several important kingdoms had emerged in the Gold Coast region. The Gonja kingdom in the north was founded by Manda-speaking peoples who had migrated from the declining Ghana Empire. The Gonja established themselves as skilled horsemen and warriors, controlling trade routes and serving as intermediaries between the forest kingdoms and the northern savanna states. Their capital at Yendi became a major commercial centre, where kola nuts from the forest were exchanged for salt and manufactured goods from the north. In the central region, the Mossi Dagomba states were establishing themselves as formidable powers. The Dagomba kingdom, with its capital at Yendi, yes, another Yendi, because apparently medieval African kingdoms had about as much imagination for city names as modern developers, naming subdivisions Greenwood, controlled important trade routes and developed a sophisticated cavalry-based military system. The Mossi states, centered in what is now Burkina Faso but extending into northern Ghana, were so militarily successful that they repeatedly raided and conquered territories of the Great Mali Empire, proving that sometimes the smaller kingdoms could punch well above their weight class. The forest regions saw the emergence of smaller but equally important kingdoms. The Akwamu kingdom began as a small state along the Birim River, but would later expand to become one of the most powerful forces in the region. The early Akwamu were master traders and diplomats, establishing commercial relationships that stretched from the Atlantic coast to the northern savanna. They developed a sophisticated intelligence network, essentially medieval-era spies, that kept them informed about political and commercial developments across a vast area. Agriculture during this period was far more sophisticated than you might imagine. The introduction of new crops from other parts of Africa and, later, from across the Atlantic, revolutionized farming practices. Yams, plantains, and various root crops became staples, while kola nuts became a major cash crop for trade. The agricultural surplus supported not just population growth but also the development of specialized crafts, metalworking, textile production, and pottery that produced goods for both local use and long-distance trade. The social organization of these early kingdoms was complex and nuanced. Most societies were organized around extended family groups and clans, with leadership often determined by a combination of heredity, achievement, and spiritual authority. Women held significant power in many societies, particularly in matters of trade and agriculture. The Akan peoples, who would later form the core of the Ashanti Empire, developed a matrilineal system where inheritance and succession passed through the female line, a system that often confused later European visitors who couldn't understand how a man could inherit from his uncle rather than his father. Religious beliefs during this period were primarily traditional African religions, though Islam was making gradual inroads through trade contacts. Traditional religions were sophisticated theological systems that emphasized the connection between the living, the ancestors, and the natural world. Sacred groves, rivers, and mountains were integral parts of religious practice, and elaborate festivals and ceremonies marked important events in the agricultural and social calendar. These weren't primitive superstitions but complex spiritual systems that provided both individual meaning and social cohesion. The art and architecture of these early kingdoms reflected their wealth and sophistication. Terracotta sculptures, bronze castings, and elaborate jewelry demonstrated advanced artistic techniques. Architecture ranged from simple but elegant compounds to impressive palaces and temples. The famous bronze weights used by Akan traders for measuring gold dust were not just functional tools but miniature works of art, often depicting animals, plants, or human figures that conveyed cultural meanings and stories. By the 15th century, the stage was set for dramatic changes that would reshape the region forever. The Portuguese had begun exploring the West African coast, and their arrival would introduce new dynamics to trade, politics, and culture. But for now, in our historical journey, we can appreciate the remarkable achievements of these early kingdoms, their sophisticated trade networks, their advanced mining techniques, their complex political systems, and their rich cultural traditions. The kingdoms and societies of pre-colonial Ghana had created something remarkable, a civilization that balanced local autonomy with regional integration, that combined agricultural productivity with commercial sophistication, and that maintained cultural distinctiveness while participating in continental and even international trade networks. They had built cities, established universities, created art, and developed technologies that would influence the region for centuries to come. As we close this first chapter of Ghana's story, it's worth reflecting on the fact that when European explorers first arrived on the Gold Coast, they found not a pristine wilderness waiting to be developed, but a region with over 1,000 years of history, home to sophisticated societies that had been mining gold, trading across continents, and governing complex states, while Europe was still emerging from its own medieval period. The foundations laid during these early centuries, the trade networks, the political structures, the cultural traditions, and the accumulated wisdom of generations, would prove remarkably resilient and would continue to shape Ghana's development through all the dramatic changes that lay ahead. The technological achievements of these early kingdoms deserve special mention as they challenge many misconceptions about pre-colonial Africa. Iron smelting, for instance, required sophisticated knowledge of chemistry and engineering. The furnaces used by ancient Ghanaian metalworkers reached temperatures of over 1,200 degrees Celsius, hot enough to melt copper pennies like chocolate chips in an oven. The iron produced wasn't just functional, it was often of higher quality than contemporary European iron, with techniques for producing steel that wouldn't be matched in Europe for several centuries. The development of the kola nut trade illustrates the economic sophistication of these early societies. Kola nuts, which contain natural caffeine, were highly prized across West Africa and the Sahel as both a stimulant and a symbol of hospitality. The trade required careful cultivation, harvesting at precisely the right time, and complex preservation techniques to ensure the nuts remained fresh during long journeys. A successful kola trader needed to understand botany, chemistry, logistics, and international relations, making them essentially the ancient equivalent of modern commodity traders, but with better fashion sense and more interesting stories. The educational systems of these early kingdoms were informal but highly effective. Knowledge was transmitted through apprenticeships, storytelling, and ritual practices. Master craftsmen would take on students who would spend years learning not just technical skills but also the cultural and spiritual aspects of their trades. Griots, professional historians and musicians, served as living libraries memorizing vast amounts of historical, genealogical, and cultural information that they would pass down through generations. Their memories were so reliable that when modern historians compare griot oral traditions with written records from Arab and European sources, the accuracy is often startling. The legal systems of these early kingdoms were remarkably sophisticated, based on customary law that balanced individual rights with community needs. Disputes were resolved through councils of elders who considered not just the immediate facts of a case, but also its broader implications for community harmony. Punishments were designed to restore balance rather than simply inflict suffering, and there were elaborate procedures for ensuring that all parties had their say. It was a legal system that prioritized justice over punishment, a concept that modern legal systems are still trying to perfect. And with that thought to ponder as you drift towards sleep, we'll pause our journey through ancient Ghana. When we return, we'll explore how the arrival of European traders would transform these established kingdoms and launch Ghana into a new and tumultuous chapter of its history. Until then, sweet dreams, and may your rest be as peaceful as a gold trader's sleep after a particularly profitable day at the markets of ancient Begho. Chapter 2: The Gold Coast and European Contact. The year 1471 marked a turning point that would echo through the centuries like a particularly persistent neighbour knocking on your door, except this neighbour brought cannons, diseases, and an insatiable appetite for gold. When Portuguese navigators João de Santarém and Pedro Escobar first glimpsed the shores of what would become known as the Gold Coast, they found not an empty wilderness, but a thriving commercial landscape that made their European markets look like weekend garage sales. The Portuguese arrival wasn't exactly a surprise to the coastal peoples. For decades, rumours had circulated about strange pale men sailing in enormous wooden houses, bringing exotic goods and speaking incomprehensible languages. The local communities, particularly around what the Portuguese would call Elmina, had been preparing for this eventual contact. They had observed similar encounters along other parts of the West African coast, and had developed sophisticated strategies for dealing with these unusual visitors, who seemed to believe that gold grew on trees and that salt was somehow less valuable than shiny metal trinkets. In 1482, the Portuguese made their boldest move yet by constructing Castelo de São Jorge da Mina, known today as Elmina Castle. This wasn't just any building project. It was the equivalent of constructing a medieval fortress using IKEA instructions, except the pieces had to be shipped across an ocean and assembled while negotiating with local chiefs who weren't entirely convinced that having a European military installation in their backyard was a good idea. The Portuguese arrived with pre-cut limestone blocks from Portugal, which must have seemed like the height of presumption. Bringing your own building materials to Africa was rather like showing up to someone's dinner party with your own plates. The construction of Elmina Castle required delicate negotiations with the local ruler, known to the Portuguese as Caramansa. These negotiations were conducted through a complex mix of Portuguese bravado, African diplomacy, and mutual misunderstanding that would have made modern United Nations translators weep with frustration. Caramansa was initially skeptical about allowing the Portuguese to build a permanent structure, particularly one that looked suspiciously like it was designed for military purposes rather than trade. The Portuguese assured him it was purely for commercial protection, much like how a modern teenager might assure their parents that the new lock on their bedroom door is purely for privacy. The establishment of the Portuguese Gold Coast fundamentally altered the economic dynamics of the region. Previously, gold had flowed northward across the Sahara through established trans-Saharan trade networks. Now, for the first time, significant quantities of West African gold began flowing directly to Europe via maritime routes. This shift was roughly equivalent to discovering that you could order your groceries online and have them delivered, thereby bypassing the traditional marketplace entirely, except in this case, the groceries were precious metals and the delivery system involved months of dangerous ocean voyages. The Portuguese weren't content with just establishing Elmina. Over the next several decades, they constructed additional forts at Axim, Shama, and other strategic points along the coast. Each fort was essentially a miniature version of European civilization, plunked down in tropical Africa, complete with European architectural styles that were spectacularly unsuited to the local climate. The Portuguese soldiers stationed in these forts faced mortality rates that would make modern insurance companies refuse coverage entirely. Tropical diseases, inadequate food supplies, and the psychological stress of being thousands of miles from home in an environment they barely understood created conditions that were, to put it mildly, challenging. Trade between the Portuguese and local African communities was conducted through a complex system of exchange that defied simple economic analysis. The Portuguese brought copper, brass, cloth, iron tools, and various European manufactured goods. In return, they received gold dust, ivory, and increasingly enslaved people captured in wars between African kingdoms. This wasn't a simple matter of economic supply and demand. It was a cultural negotiation that required both sides to understand and accommodate radically different concepts of value, trade protocols, and social relationships. The African response to European contact was far more sophisticated than European accounts typically acknowledged. Local leaders quickly grasped that European competition for African goods could be leveraged to their advantage. They developed strategies for playing different European powers against each other, much like how modern consumers might comparison shop between different retailers. African merchants became adept at European languages and customs, while maintaining their own cultural practices and political autonomy. They were, in essence, the world's first truly global entrepreneurs. By the early 1600s, the Portuguese monopoly on Gold Coast trade was increasingly challenged by other European powers. The Dutch, English, French, Swedish, and even Danish companies all sought to establish their own footholds on the coast. This competition turned the Gold Coast into something resembling a very dangerous game of Risk, where the players were European trading companies and the board was the entire West African coastline. Each European power sought to build forts, establish trade relationships with African rulers, and exclude their competitors from profitable commerce. The Dutch proved to be particularly persistent competitors. Beginning in 1596, they mounted repeated attempts to capture Elmina Castle from the Portuguese. These early attempts failed spectacularly, often with the help of local Ghanaian allies who had developed profitable relationships with the Portuguese and weren't particularly interested in changing management. It's worth noting that African communities weren't passive victims in these European conflicts. They were active participants who made strategic decisions about which European powers to support based on their own interests and assessments of long-term advantages. Everything changed in August 1637 when the Dutch finally succeeded in capturing Elmina Castle. This victory wasn't achieved through superior European military tactics alone. It required the Dutch to convince significant numbers of African allies from Eguafo and Acebu to join their assault. The conquest of Elmina marked the beginning of Dutch dominance on the Gold Coast, a period that would last for over 2 centuries and fundamentally reshape the region's relationship with the broader Atlantic world. Under Dutch control, Elmina became the headquarters of the Dutch West India Company's operations in West Africa. The Dutch brought a different approach to colonial administration than the Portuguese had employed. They were, arguably, more systematic in their exploitation of local resources, but also more willing to integrate African political structures into their commercial operations. The Dutch understood that successful trade required stable relationships with African rulers and were generally more flexible in their diplomatic approaches than their Portuguese predecessors. The transformation of the slave trade under Dutch administration represents one of the darkest chapters in Gold Coast history. While the Portuguese had engaged in slave trading, the Dutch systematized and expanded the practice to supply their colonies in the Americas, particularly Dutch Brazil and later the Caribbean islands. Elmina Castle was modified to serve as a major slave depot, with dungeons that could hold hundreds of captives awaiting shipment across the Atlantic. The castle that had been built to facilitate gold trading gradually became primarily associated with the horrors of human bondage. The scale of the slave trade that developed under Dutch control was staggering by any measure. By the 18th century, an estimated 30,000 enslaved Africans passed through Elmina Castle annually. These numbers represent individual human tragedies multiplied beyond easy comprehension, families torn apart, communities destroyed, and entire cultures disrupted by the systematic capture and sale of human beings. The economic profits from this trade supported Dutch commercial expansion across the globe, while the human costs were borne primarily by African societies. Meanwhile, other European powers were establishing their own footholds along the Gold Coast. The English built Cape Coast Castle, which became the rival to Dutch Elmina and the centre of British operations in the region. The Swedes, Danes, and French all maintained smaller forts and trading posts. By the late 1700s, the Gold Coast resembled a complex patchwork of European enclaves, each flying different flags and competing for African trade and loyalty. African rulers navigated this complex diplomatic landscape with remarkable skill, often maintaining relationships with multiple European powers simultaneously. The impact of European contact on African societies was profound and multifaceted. On the economic front, the introduction of European goods, particularly firearms, altered the balance of power between African kingdoms and transformed patterns of warfare. States with access to European weapons gained significant advantages over their neighbours, leading to cycles of conquest and displacement that reverberated across the entire region. The demand for slaves to trade for these weapons created powerful incentives for warfare and slave raiding that fundamentally altered social and political structures. Cultural changes were equally significant, though often more subtle. Christianity was introduced by European missionaries and traders, though it initially made limited inroads against established African religious systems. More importantly, the constant presence of Europeans and the products of European technology gradually familiarized African societies with different ways of organizing economic and social life. Some African communities adopted European architectural styles, dress, and customs, while others deliberately maintained traditional practices as a form of cultural resistance. The demographic impact of the slave trade cannot be overstated. Conservative estimates suggest that over the course of 3 centuries, millions of people were forcibly removed from the Gold Coast region. This massive population loss had cascading effects on agricultural production, technological development, and social organization. Communities were forced to develop defensive strategies that prioritized security over economic development, leading to the abandonment of vulnerable settlements and the concentration of populations in more easily defended locations. By the early 1800s, the dynamics of European-African relations on the Gold Coast were beginning to shift dramatically. The British Parliament abolished the slave trade in 1807, followed by similar actions by other European powers over the next several decades. This abolition didn't immediately end the slave trade. Illegal slaving continued for decades, but it fundamentally altered the economic rationale for European involvement in West Africa. European powers were forced to identify new forms of profitable commerce to justify maintaining their expensive coastal forts and administrative structures. The search for alternatives to slave trading led to increased European interest in what they termed legitimate commerce, trade in palm oil, ivory, gold, and other natural products. Palm oil, in particular, became increasingly valuable as European industrial development created new demands for lubricants and soap-making materials. This shift toward legitimate commerce required different relationships with African societies. Rather than simply purchasing enslaved people captured in wars, Europeans now needed stable, long-term commercial partnerships with African producers and merchants. The period from 1807 to 1850 marked a transitional era in Gold Coast history. The gradual decline of the slave trade coincided with growing European interest in expanding their territorial control beyond the immediate vicinity of coastal forts. British administrators, in particular, began to envision a more extensive colonial presence that would provide greater security for commerce and more direct control over African political affairs. This vision would soon lead to direct military confrontation with the most powerful indigenous state in the region, the Asante Empire. The Asante Empire, centered in the interior around the capital city of Kumasi, had emerged as the dominant power in the Gold Coast region during the 18th century. The Asante had skillfully exploited European competition to build a powerful military machine equipped with European firearms. They controlled access to many of the gold mines that supplied the coastal trade and had established their own diplomatic relationships with various European powers. By the early 19th century, the Asante Empire represented the most significant challenge to European ambitions for expanded territorial control. Tensions between the Asante Empire and the British were building throughout the early 1800s. The British sought to expand their influence beyond the coastal regions and to establish more direct control over trade routes to the interior. The Asante, quite reasonably, viewed these British ambitions as threats to their sovereignty and commercial interests. Both sides engaged in complex diplomatic negotiations, but fundamental disagreements about political authority and commercial control proved impossible to resolve peacefully. As we reached the mid-19th century, the Gold Coast stood at a historical crossroads. The era of purely commercial European involvement was ending, and the age of direct colonial control was beginning. The established patterns of trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange that had developed over 3.5 centuries were about to be transformed by military conquest and the imposition of European administrative systems. The stage was set for the dramatic conflicts that would determine whether African political independence could be maintained in the face of increasingly aggressive European expansionism. The legacy of this long period of European contact was deeply ambivalent. On one hand, the Gold Coast had been integrated into global trading networks, exposed to new technologies and ideas, and had developed sophisticated diplomatic and commercial expertise. On the other hand, the slave trade had caused immeasurable human suffering and social disruption, while European competition had contributed to political instability and warfare. African societies had demonstrated remarkable adaptability and resilience in the face of these challenges, but the fundamental question of political sovereignty remained unresolved as European powers prepared for their final assault on African independence. Chapter 3: Colonial Ghana and the Struggle for Independence. The middle of the 19th century found the Gold Coast balanced on the edge of dramatic transformation, much like a person standing at the edge of a diving board, knowing that the next step would change everything, but not entirely sure whether they were about to execute a graceful swan dive or an embarrassing belly flop. The British, who had been content for centuries to maintain their influence through coastal trading posts, were increasingly convinced that more direct control was necessary to protect their commercial interests and, not coincidentally, to prevent other European powers from gaining similar advantages. The catalyst for this transformation came in the form of conflict with the Asante Empire, the most powerful indigenous state in the region. The Asante had built their strength through a combination of military prowess, diplomatic skill, and control over gold mining regions in the interior. By the 1840s, they had created what was essentially a West African superpower, complete with a professional army, sophisticated administrative systems, and a capital city at Kumasi that rivaled anything Europe had to offer. The only problem, from the British perspective, was that the Asante were entirely too independent-minded and showed an alarming tendency to make their own decisions about trade, politics, and territorial control. The First Anglo-Asante War erupted in 1824 when British Governor Sir Charles Macarthy decided that the best way to establish British authority was through a show of military force. Macarthy's confidence in European military superiority proved to be dramatically misplaced. On January 22nd, 1824, at the Battle of Nsamankau, the Asante army comprehensively defeated the British forces and killed Macarthy himself. This was the sort of military embarrassment that British colonial administrators generally preferred not to discuss in their reports back to London, rather like how modern politicians avoid mentioning their most spectacular campaign failures. The defeat at Nzamankau forced the British to reconsider their approach to the Gold Coast. For the next several decades, they attempted to manage their interests through a combination of diplomacy, economic incentives, and strategic alliances with coastal peoples who had their own reasons for opposing Asante expansion. This period saw the development of the Bond of 1844, an agreement between the British and various Fanti chiefs that established a framework for cooperation while technically preserving African sovereignty. The bond was a masterpiece of diplomatic ambiguity, carefully worded to mean different things to different parties. However, by the 1870s, British patience with diplomatic solutions was wearing thin. The discovery of diamonds in South Africa and growing European competition for African territories created pressures for more direct control. The Third Anglo-Asante War of 1873 to 1874 marked the beginning of the end for Asante independence. Led by General Garnet Wolseley, the British mounted a massive military expedition that succeeded in capturing and burning Kumasi, the Asante capital. The sacking of Kumasi was both a military victory and a cultural catastrophe. Kumasi had been one of Africa's most impressive cities, with broad avenues, elaborate royal palaces, and architectural achievements that challenged European assumptions about African civilization. The British systematically looted the city's treasures, including the famous golden artifacts that would later fill European museums while being labelled as examples of primitive African art. It was rather like burning down the Louvre and then claiming that the French had no artistic traditions. The final blow to Asante independence came with the War of the Golden Stool in 1900, a conflict that began with one of the most spectacular displays of cultural insensitivity in the annals of colonial administration. Governor Sir Frederick Hodgson, apparently believing that all African customs were essentially meaningless ceremonial display, demanded that the Asante surrender their golden stool so that he, as the representative of British authority, could sit upon it. This demand was roughly equivalent to asking the British to hand over the crown jewels so that a foreign occupier could wear them to a dinner party. The golden stool wasn't simply a piece of furniture, it was the spiritual embodiment of the Asante nation. Believed to contain the soul of the Asante people, asking the Asante to surrender, it was asking them to cease existing as a people. The response was immediate and fierce. Ya Asantewa, the Queen Mother of Ejisu, delivered what became one of the most famous speeches in African history, challenging the men of Asante. "If you men of Asante will not go forward, then we will. We the women will. I shall call upon my fellow women. We will fight the white men. We will fight till the last of us falls in the battlefields." Yaa Asantewa's war was both a military campaign and a statement of principle. For 3 months, Asante forces besieged the British in Kumasi, demonstrating that African resistance to European colonialism was far from finished. The eventual British victory came only after the arrival of significant reinforcements and represented the last major armed resistance to British control in the Gold Coast. Yaa Asantewa herself was captured and exiled to the Seychelles, where she died 20 years later, far from the land she had fought so desperately to defend. With the defeat of the Asante, the British were finally able to establish the Gold Coast colony as a unified political entity. On January 1st, 1902, the Asante territories were formally incorporated into the British Empire, creating a colonial administration that extended from the coast to the Northern Territories. This new colonial state combined the coastal Gold Coast proper, the conquered Asante regions, and the Northern Territories Protectorate into a single administrative unit that roughly corresponded to the boundaries of modern Ghana. The British colonial administration in the Gold Coast followed patterns that had been developed in other parts of the empire, but with local adaptations that reflected both practical necessities and British misconceptions about African society. The colonial government was headed by a British governor who wielded enormous power, but who was often remarkably ignorant about the societies he was supposed to govern. Below the governor, British administrators worked through a system of indirect rule that attempted to use existing African political structures while ensuring that real power remained in British hands. The economic transformation of the Gold Coast under colonial rule was dramatic and often disruptive. The British were primarily interested in extracting natural resources and creating markets for British manufactured goods. Gold mining continued to be important, but the colonial period saw the introduction of large-scale cocoa cultivation, which would eventually become the backbone of the colonial economy. Cocoa farming was initially developed by African entrepreneurs who recognized the commercial potential of the crop, but British colonial policies gradually shifted control toward European companies and settler interests. The introduction of cocoa cultivation created a new class of African entrepreneurs, while colonial education policies designed to produce clerks and administrators had unintended consequences. African students often turned European ideas about democracy and rights against colonial rule itself. The First and Second World Wars accelerated political developments dramatically. Gold Coast soldiers served in various theatres, returning with expanded horizons and new ideas about their rights. The Second World War created particular economic pressures, and in February 1948, accumulated tensions exploded into widespread riots and demonstrations that shocked the colonial administration. Into this volatile political situation stepped Kwame Nkrumah, a young Gold Coast intellectual who had spent 12 years studying and organizing in the United States and Britain. Nkrumah had been invited back to the Gold Coast in 1947 to serve as secretary of the United Gold Coast Convention, a political organization dominated by lawyers, teachers, and other members of the African professional class. However, Nkrumah quickly concluded that the UGCC's gradualist approach to political change was inadequate for the revolutionary moment that was developing. In 1949, Nkrumah broke away from the UGCC to form the Convention People's Party, a political organization that demanded immediate self-government and employed tactics that scandalized the colonial establishment. The CPP appealed directly to ordinary people, workers, farmers, petty traders, and unemployed youth, rather than limiting itself to the educated elite. Nkrumah's slogan, "Self-Government Now," was simple, direct, and revolutionary in its implications. The CPP's strategy of positive action drew inspiration from Gandhi's Indian independence movement, but was adapted to Gold Coast conditions. Positive action involved strikes, boycotts, civil disobedience, and mass demonstrations designed to make the colony ungovernable while maintaining the moral high ground through commitment to non-violence. This was political jiu-jitsu of the highest order, using the colonizers' own stated values against their continued domination. The colonial government's response to positive action was predictably repressive. In January 1950, Nkrumah and other CPP leaders were arrested and imprisoned for sedition. The British authorities apparently believed that removing Nkrumah from the political scene would cause the independence movement to collapse, rather like pulling the lead singer from a band and expecting the music to stop. This proved to be a serious miscalculation. The February 1951 general election demonstrated the extent of popular support for the independence movement. Despite Nkrumah's imprisonment, the CPP won a decisive victory, capturing 34 of the 38 contested seats. The election results created an impossible situation for the colonial government. They could hardly claim to be governing with the consent of the people, while the people had clearly voted for leaders who were sitting in prison for opposing colonial rule. Faced with this political reality, Governor Charles Arden Clark made the pragmatic decision to release Nkrumah from prison and invite him to form a government. This was a remarkable moment in the history of decolonization, a colonial governor essentially acknowledging that he could not govern without the cooperation of the very people his government had just imprisoned for treason. Nkrumah's journey from prison cell to Prime Minister's office in a matter of days was a powerful symbol of how quickly the political landscape was changing. As leader of government business and later Prime Minister, Nkrumah faced the delicate challenge of working within the colonial system while continuing to push for complete independence. The period from 1951 to 1957 represented a gradual transfer of power, with the British retaining control over defence, foreign affairs, and financial policy while increasingly allowing African politicians to manage domestic affairs. This was rather like teaching someone to drive by, gradually letting them take control of different parts of the car. The transition period was not without tensions. The Ashanti region developed its own political movements suspicious of CPP domination, occasionally erupting into violence. The final push toward independence gained momentum after the CPP's 1956 election victory, despite continued regional opposition. On March 6, 1957, the Gold Coast became the independent nation of Ghana, taking its name from the ancient West African Empire as a symbol of African pride and achievement. Kwame Nkrumah became the first Prime Minister of independent Ghana, addressing a massive crowd in Accra with words that would resonate across the African continent. At long last, the battle has ended, and thus, Ghana, your beloved country, is free forever. The achievement of Ghanaian independence was profoundly significant, both for Ghana itself and for the broader struggle against colonialism across Africa. Ghana became the first sub-Saharan African colony to achieve independence, demonstrating that European colonial rule was not permanent and inevitable but could be challenged and defeated through organized political action. The success of the Ghanaian independence movement inspired similar struggles across the continent and contributed to what would become known as the Year of Africa in 1960. But independence also brought new challenges and responsibilities. The colonial economy had been designed to extract raw materials for export to Britain and to import British manufactured goods. Building a genuinely independent economy would require fundamental restructuring of these colonial relationships. The colonial education system had produced clerks and administrators, but not the engineers, scientists, and technicians needed for industrial development. Most challenging of all, the colonial period had created new forms of political identity and conflict that could not simply be wished away at independence. The political coalition that had won independence was already showing signs of strain by 1957. The CPP's dominance was increasingly challenged by regional and ethnic movements that felt excluded from power. Traditional authorities, who had been marginalized by the independence movement, sought to restore their influence in the new political system. The educated elite, who had initially supported the independence struggle, were sometimes uncomfortable with Nkrumah's populist appeal and radical rhetoric. As the crowd celebrated in Accra on Independence Night, with Nkrumah declaring that Ghanaian independence was meaningless unless it was linked to the liberation of all Africa, few could have predicted the challenges that lay ahead. The euphoria of independence would gradually give way to the hard realities of nation-building, economic development, and political consolidation. The struggle for political independence had been won, but the struggle for genuine economic and social independence was just beginning. Chapter 4: Modern Ghana, Nkrumah Era and Political Evolution. The euphoria of independence lasted approximately as long as most New Year's resolutions, sincere at first, then gradually complicated by the harsh realities of everyday life. Kwame Nkrumah, who had led Ghana to freedom with inspiring rhetoric about African unity and socialist transformation, now faced the considerably less glamorous task of actually running a country. It was rather like the difference between winning a marathon and then discovering you now have to organize the entire Olympic Games. Nkrumah's vision for Ghana was nothing if not ambitious. He envisioned transforming what had been a colonial extraction economy into a modern, industrialized African state that would serve as a beacon for the entire continent. His development plans included massive infrastructure projects like the Akosombo Dam, which would provide hydroelectric power for aluminum smelting, and new universities that would train the next generation of African leaders. The scale of these projects was breathtaking, and so, unfortunately, was their cost. The Convention People's Party government launched an ambitious program of import substitution, industrialization, attempting to reduce Ghana's dependence on foreign goods by producing everything domestically. The theory was sound. Why import shoes when you could build shoe factories? But the practice proved considerably more challenging. Building a modern industrial economy from scratch required enormous capital investment, technical expertise that Ghana largely lacked, and markets that could absorb the products. It was rather like deciding to perform brain surgery based on having watched a few medical documentaries. Meanwhile, Nkrumah's foreign policy was making his government increasingly unpopular with Western powers, particularly the United States and Britain. His commitment to non-alignment during the Cold War, combined with his acceptance of aid from the Soviet Union and China, alarmed Western governments who preferred their former colonies to remain safely within the Western economic sphere. Nkrumah's Pan-African activities, including support for independence movements across the continent, were viewed as dangerously destabilizing by colonial powers who were hoping to manage decolonization on their own terms. Domestically, Nkrumah faced the challenge of building national unity in a country where colonial rule had both created and exploited ethnic and regional divisions. The northern regions, which had been administered as a separate protectorate under colonial rule, felt marginalized by development policies that focused primarily on the cocoa-growing areas of the south. The Ashanti region, which had maintained a strong sense of cultural identity despite colonial conquest, was suspicious of Nkrumah's centralizing policies and his appeals to mass democracy. By the early 1960s, these various pressures were beginning to undermine the CPP's political dominance. Economic problems, exacerbated by falling cocoa prices on world markets, created popular discontent. Opposition political parties, increasingly frustrated by their inability to compete effectively with the CPP's political machine, began to consider extra-constitutional means of gaining power. Nkrumah's response was to move increasingly toward authoritarian rule, using the Preventive Detention Act to imprison political opponents without trial and eventually declaring Ghana a one-party state. The irony was palpable. The man who had led Ghana to independence through appeals to democratic rights was now undermining those same rights in the name of national unity and development. Nkrumah genuinely believed that Ghana needed strong central leadership to overcome the legacy of colonialism, but his methods increasingly resembled those of the colonial rulers he had opposed. It was a pattern that would be repeated across post-colonial Africa as revolutionary leaders struggled with the gap between their democratic ideals and the practical challenges of governing divided societies with weak institutions. On February 24, 1966, while Nkrumah was on a diplomatic mission to China and Vietnam, Ghana's military and police forces staged a coup that brought his government to an abrupt end. The operation, codenamed Cold Chop, was led by officers including Lieutenant General Joseph Arthur Ankra and Major Akwazi Afrifa, who justified their actions by citing Nkrumah's authoritarian rule, economic mismanagement, and corruption. The coup was swift and bloodless, demonstrating just how isolated Nkrumah had become from important segments of Ghanaian society. The success of the 1966 coup reflected several important factors. The military had become alienated by Nkrumah's creation of his own Presidential Guard regiment, which they viewed as a threat to their institutional interests. The economic crisis had created widespread popular discontent, particularly in urban areas where the effects of inflation and shortages were most keenly felt. Perhaps most importantly, Nkrumah's Pan-African activities and socialist rhetoric had made him powerful enemies internationally, and there is strong evidence that the United States Central Intelligence Agency provided support to the coup plotters. The National Liberation Council that took power after the coup immediately set about dismantling Nkrumah's political and economic legacy. The CPP was banned, its leaders imprisoned or exiled, and Nkrumah's ambitious development projects were either cancelled or scaled back dramatically. The new government adopted a free market economic approach, seeking assistance from the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, while distancing Ghana from its previous socialist allies. It was essentially a complete reversal of direction, like suddenly deciding to drive to a different destination halfway through a long journey. The NLC ruled for 3 years before organising elections that brought Dr. Kofi Busia and his Progress Party to power in 1969. Busia was an academic and long-time opponent of Nkrumah who promised to restore democratic government and fiscal responsibility. However, the challenges that had undermined Nkrumah's government, economic dependence on cocoa exports, limited industrial capacity, ethnic and regional divisions, had not magically disappeared with the change of leadership. Busia's government faced immediate economic pressures that severely limited its options. Ghana's external debt had grown dramatically during the Nkrumah years, and the new government was forced to implement austerity measures that proved deeply unpopular. When Busia devalued the Ghanaian currency in December 1971 to meet International Monetary Fund requirements, he sparked widespread opposition that included strikes by civil servants and students. The devaluation particularly angered military officers, who saw their purchasing power dramatically reduced. On January 13, 1972, Lieutenant Colonel Ignatius Kutu Achiampong led another military coup that overthrew Busia's government. Achiampong's National Redemption Council initially enjoyed considerable popular support by reversing many of Busia's austerity measures and rejecting foreign debt obligations. However, the underlying economic problems that had plagued both Nkrumah and Busia remained unsolved, and by the late 1970s, Ghana's economy was in worse shape than ever. The period from 1972 to 1979 saw Ghana's political situation deteriorate steadily under increasingly corrupt and ineffective military rule. Inflation reached catastrophic levels, basic commodities disappeared from markets, and a thriving black market economy emerged. Lieutenant General Frederick Akufo overthrew Achiampong in July 1978, but proved even less effective. Into this chaos stepped a young flight lieutenant named Jerry John Rawlings, whose first coup attempt on May 15, 1979, failed spectacularly and landed him in prison awaiting court-martial. However, on June 4, 1979, sympathetic soldiers freed Rawlings and overthrew the Akufo government. What followed was unlike anything Ghana had experienced before, a revolution led not by senior military officers or civilian politicians, but by junior ranks who claimed to represent the common people against a corrupt elite. Rawlings's Armed Forces Revolutionary Council embarked on what it called a house-cleaning exercise designed to purge corruption from Ghanaian society. The AFRC's approach to this task was both dramatic and brutal. 3 former heads of state, Generals Afrifa, Achiampong, and Akufo, were executed by firing squad, along with 5 other senior military officers. Market traders suspected of profiteering had their stalls destroyed, and suspected corrupt officials were subjected to public humiliation. It was revolutionary justice with a distinctly theatrical flair. What made Rawlings's approach particularly interesting was its combination of populist rhetoric with a genuine commitment to returning power to civilians. After 4 months of revolutionary government, the AFRC handed power to Dr. Hiller Lyman of the People's National Party, who had won elections held as scheduled in June 1979. This was almost unprecedented in African politics, a military government that actually kept its promise to restore civilian rule. However, the Lyman government inherited an economic situation that bordered on the impossible. Ghana's economy had essentially collapsed, with industrial capacity operating at less than 20% of capacity, government revenues unable to cover basic services, and massive external debt that the country could not service. Lyman's efforts to address these problems through conventional economic policies proved inadequate to the scale of the crisis. On December 31, 1981, Rawlings staged his second coup, this time establishing the Provisional National Defence Council with himself as chairman. This second Rawlings government was fundamentally different from the first. Rather than a brief house-cleaning exercise, it became a sustained attempt at revolutionary transformation of Ghanaian society. The PNDC claimed to be implementing a national democratic revolution that would restructure Ghana's economy and political system according to principles of social justice and popular participation. The early years of PNDC rule were marked by radical rhetoric and experimental policies that often seemed to change direction with bewildering frequency. People's Defence Committees were established in workplaces and communities to monitor local administration and combat corruption. Workers' Defence Committees were supposed to increase productivity and worker participation in industrial management. Citizens' tribunals were created to provide speedier and more accessible justice than the formal court system. It was an attempt to create participatory democracy through revolutionary institutions. However, by the mid-1980s, it had become clear that revolutionary enthusiasm alone could not solve Ghana's economic problems. The PNDC gradually abandoned its socialist rhetoric and radical institutional experiments in favor of a structural adjustment program negotiated with the World Bank and International Monetary Fund. This economic recovery program, launched in 1983, represented one of the most comprehensive attempts at market-oriented economic reform in Africa. The shift from revolutionary populism to market-oriented reform was one of the most remarkable political transformations in modern African history. Rawlings, who had come to power denouncing international financial institutions and promising to put the interests of ordinary Ghanaians first, now implemented policies that included massive currency devaluations, removal of government subsidies, privatization of state enterprises, and retrenchment of government employees. It was rather like watching a punk rock band transform itself into a symphony orchestra. The economic reforms were painful but gradually began to show results. Inflation was brought under control, export production began to recover, and government finances were stabilized. However, the social costs were enormous. Government employment was cut dramatically, user fees were introduced for health and education services, and subsidies for basic commodities were removed. The urban working class, which had been core supporters of the PNDC's revolutionary rhetoric, bore much of the burden of adjustment. By the late 1980s, pressure was mounting both domestically and internationally for political liberalization to accompany economic reform. The end of the Cold War had reduced international tolerance for authoritarian governments, while Ghana's improved economic performance had created new social groups, particularly an emerging business class, that demanded greater political participation. Students, professional associations, and church groups increasingly called for a return to multi-party democracy. Rawlings's response to these pressures was characteristically pragmatic. Rather than resist democratization, he chose to lead it, calculating that his personal popularity and the PNDC's economic achievements would translate into electoral success. In 1991, a new constitution was approved that established a multi-party system, and in 1992, Ghana held its first competitive elections since 1979. The 1992 elections marked the beginning of what has become known as Ghana's Fourth Republic. Rawlings, running as the candidate of the hastily formed National Democratic Congress, won the presidential election with 58% of the vote. The opposition, led by Professor Albert Adu-Boahen of the New Patriotic Party, cried fraud and boycotted the subsequent parliamentary elections, but international observers generally judged the elections to be free and fair, if not perfect. The successful transition to multi-party democracy in Ghana was significant not just for Ghana itself, but for the entire African continent. By the early 1990s, most African countries were experiencing pressure for political liberalization, but few had managed the transition as smoothly as Ghana. The combination of economic stabilization and political opening provided a model that other African countries would attempt to emulate, though with varying degrees of success. Rawlings won re-election in 1996, again defeating the NPP candidate John Kufuor, but constitutional term limits prevented him from running for a third consecutive term. The fact that he accepted these limits and began preparing for a genuine transfer of power was itself remarkable in the African context, where many leaders have found creative ways to extend their rule indefinitely. The stage was set for the 2000 elections that would test whether Ghana's democratic institutions could survive a change of ruling party. Chapter 5: Contemporary Ghana and Economic Development. The dawn of the new millennium found Ghana poised at what political scientists like to call a critical juncture, one of those historical moments when the choices made would determine the trajectory for decades to come. The December 2000 elections would test whether the democratic institutions established in 1992 could survive something that had proven fatal to many African democracies, the peaceful transfer of power from a ruling party to the opposition. Jerry Rawlings, who had dominated Ghanaian politics for nearly 2 decades, was constitutionally prevented from seeking a third term. His vice president, John Atta Mills of the National Democratic Congress, faced off against John Kufuor of the New Patriotic Party in what would become one of the most significant elections in African history. The campaign was hard-fought but peaceful, and when no candidate received the required 50% of votes in the first round, Ghana prepared for its first presidential runoff election. On December 28, 2000, Ghanaians returned to the polls for the second round of voting. When the results were announced, John Kufuor had won with 57% of the vote. More importantly, Rawlings gracefully conceded defeat and participated in a smooth transfer of power to his political rival. The sight of Rawlings handing over the presidential sash to Kufuor on January 7, 2001, was broadcast across Africa as proof that peaceful democratic transitions were possible on the continent. The significance of this moment cannot be overstated. Ghana had achieved something that many political theorists considered essential for democratic consolidation: the two-turnover test, where power transfers peacefully from one party to another and then back again. It was rather like successfully teaching your teenager to drive the family car without wrecking it, a milestone that suggests the system might actually work in the long term. President Kufuor, known as the Gentle Giant, brought a different style of leadership to Ghana. A lawyer and businessman with a calm demeanour, he focused on economic liberalisation and attracting foreign investment. His administration implemented what became known as the Golden Age of business policies, reducing government regulation, improving the investment climate, and working to integrate Ghana more fully into the global economy. The irony was not lost on observers that the man who defeated Rawlings was implementing many of the same market-oriented policies that Rawlings had adopted in his later years. Under Kufuor's leadership, Ghana experienced steady economic growth averaging around 6% annually. The government successfully completed the heavily indebted poor country's debt relief initiative, which eliminated much of Ghana's external debt burden. Infrastructure development accelerated, with improvements to roads, telecommunications, and power generation. Perhaps most importantly, the economy began to diversify beyond its traditional reliance on gold, cocoa, and timber exports. However, the most dramatic change in Ghana's economic fortunes came in June 2007, when Tullow Oil and Cosmos Energy announced the discovery of significant oil reserves in the Jubilee field off the western coast. The discovery was estimated to contain up to 3 billion barrels of oil, instantly transforming Ghana from an aid-dependent nation into a potentially oil-rich country. President Kufuor declared that Ghana would become the center of attraction in Africa, and expectations soared across the country. The oil discovery came at a particularly auspicious time, Ghana's 50th independence anniversary year. It seemed like a divine gift to mark the country's golden jubilee, and politicians across the spectrum made extravagant promises about how oil revenues would transform the nation. The discovery also complicated the 2008 elections, as both the NPP and NDC sought to convince voters they were better positioned to manage the expected oil windfall. In a closely contested election that required a runoff, John Atta Mills of the NDC finally achieved victory, becoming president by the narrowest margin in Ghana's electoral history. Mills, an academic and former tax law professor, had been Rawlings's vice president and had lost to Kufuor twice before. His victory marked Ghana's second peaceful transfer of power and further consolidated the country's democratic credentials. Mills's campaign had emphasized his integrity and competence, positioning him as the right person to manage Ghana's transition to an oil-producing nation. The Mills administration faced the complex challenge of managing Ghana's new oil wealth while avoiding the resource curse that had afflicted many African oil producers. The government established the Petroleum Revenue Management Act, creating institutions to ensure transparent management of oil revenues and prevent the corruption and economic distortions that oil wealth often brings. In December 2010, Ghana officially began commercial oil production, with the first barrels ceremonially lifted from the Jubilee field. However, Ghana's oil story proved more complicated than the initial euphoria suggested. Production levels were often below projections, technical problems reduced output, and global oil price fluctuations affected revenues. Meanwhile, the costs of oil production, including environmental impacts on coastal communities, disruption to traditional fishing industries, and inflationary pressures in oil-producing regions, became increasingly apparent. The dream of instant transformation through oil wealth gradually gave way to a more sober understanding of oil as just one component of long-term development. Tragically, President Mills died in office in July 2012, just months before the next scheduled election. His death was met with genuine national mourning, as Mills had been widely respected for his humility and integrity. Vice President John Mahama assumed the presidency and went on to win the December 2012 election in his own right, though the NPP challenged the results in court before eventually accepting the Supreme Court's decision to uphold Mahama's victory. President Mahama inherited significant economic challenges that had been building throughout the Mills years. The global financial crisis of 2008 had reduced demand for Ghana's exports, while increased government spending in anticipation of oil revenues had created fiscal imbalances. By 2014, Ghana was experiencing its worst economic crisis since the structural adjustment years of the 1980s, with high inflation, currency depreciation, and growing external debt forcing the government to seek assistance from the International Monetary Fund. The economic difficulties created political opportunities for the opposition NPP, which had reorganized under the leadership of Nana Akufo-Addo, a lawyer and politician who had narrowly lost to both Mills and Mahama in previous elections. Akufo-Addo's message of economic competence and efficient governance resonated with voters frustrated by corruption scandals and economic hardship. In the December 2016 election, Akufo-Addo defeated Mahama, marking Ghana's third peaceful transfer of power between rival parties. The Akufo-Addo administration launched an ambitious development agenda centered around what it called Ghana Beyond Aid, emphasizing economic self-reliance and reduced dependence on foreign assistance. The government implemented free senior high school education, a massive infrastructure program called One District, One Factory, and various social protection initiatives. The administration also focused heavily on digitalization, implementing systems for mobile money, digital identification, and property, addressing that transformed how Ghanaians interact with government and financial services. However, Akufo-Addo's presidency was also marked by significant challenges. Corruption scandals, though less severe than in some neighbouring countries, continued to undermine public confidence. The government's ambitious spending programs, combined with the global economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, created new fiscal pressures. Most concerning for many Ghanaians, illegal small-scale mining known as galamsey dramatically expanded during this period, causing severe environmental damage to rivers, forests, and agricultural lands. The galamsey crisis illustrates the complex challenges facing contemporary Ghana. While the government has pursued policies to formalize the mining sector and attract legitimate investment, thousands of young Ghanaians have turned to illegal mining as economic opportunities remain limited in rural areas. The environmental destruction has been devastating. Entire river systems have been polluted, forest reserves have been degraded, and agricultural productivity has declined in affected areas. It's a stark reminder that economic development without environmental sustainability is ultimately self-defeating. Throughout this period, Ghana's democracy has continued to mature and evolve. Elections have become increasingly competitive, with margins of victory narrowing and voter turnout remaining high. Civil society organizations have become more sophisticated and assertive in holding government accountable. The media landscape has expanded dramatically, with dozens of radio stations, television channels, and online platforms providing diverse perspectives on political and social issues. Traditional authorities have adapted to democratic governance while maintaining their cultural significance. The December 2020 election saw Akufo-Addo narrowly win re-election against John Mahama, who was seeking a comeback after his defeat 4 years earlier. The election was Ghana's closest ever, with Akufo-Addo winning just over 51% of the vote. The results were disputed by the NDC, which petitioned the Supreme Court, but the court ultimately upheld Akufo-Addo's victory. While the election demonstrated the vibrancy of Ghana's democracy, it also revealed growing polarization and concerns about the independence of key institutions like the Electoral Commission and the judiciary. The most recent chapter in Ghana's democratic story unfolded in December 2024, when the country held its 9th presidential election since the return to multi-party democracy. In a significant development, former President John Mahama achieved a comeback victory, defeating the NPP's candidate, Vice President Mahamudu Bawumia. Mahama's victory marked the 4th peaceful transfer of power in Ghana's history and demonstrated the continued vitality of the country's democratic institutions. Looking at Ghana's trajectory over the past quarter century, several patterns emerge. Economically, the country has achieved significant progress while facing persistent challenges. GDP per capita has more than doubled since 2000, poverty rates have declined substantially, and access to education and healthcare has improved markedly. However, unemployment remains high, particularly among young people, and income inequality has widened. The discovery of oil brought new revenues, but also new complications, including environmental challenges and questions about sustainable resource management. Socially, Ghana has maintained its reputation as one of Africa's most peaceful and tolerant societies. Religious and ethnic diversity has generally been managed successfully, though occasional tensions remind observers that social harmony requires constant attention and good leadership. Urbanization has accelerated rapidly, with cities like Accra and Kumasi experiencing explosive growth that has strained infrastructure and created new social challenges. The emergence of a significant Ghanaian diaspora has created new connections to global markets and ideas, while also raising questions about brain drain. Politically, Ghana's democratic institutions have proven remarkably resilient. The regular alternation of power between rival parties has become normalized, and public expectations of democratic governance have risen significantly. However, challenges remain, including concerns about corruption, the independence of key institutions, and the growing cost of political campaigns. The fact that Ghana's elections have become increasingly competitive is both a sign of democratic health and a source of potential instability if not managed carefully. As Ghana approaches the midpoint of the 21st century, it stands as one of Africa's most successful democracies and one of the continent's more dynamic economies. The challenges facing the country, managing natural resources sustainably, creating employment for a young and growing population, maintaining social cohesion in an increasingly diverse society, and preserving democratic institutions while ensuring effective governance, are shared by many middle-income countries around the world. Ghana's experience suggests that while there are no easy answers to these challenges, they are not insurmountable for societies with strong institutions, engaged citizens, and committed leadership. The story of contemporary Ghana offers both inspiration and sobering realism for those interested in African development. The country has demonstrated that democracy can work in Africa, that economic growth is possible without sacrificing political freedoms, and that peaceful societies can be maintained even amid significant social and economic changes. At the same time, Ghana's experience shows that development is a long-term process that requires constant attention to institution building, environmental sustainability, and social inclusion. The next chapter of Ghana's story remains to be written, but the foundation established over the past 25 years provides reason for cautious optimism about the future. Chapter 6: Geography, Culture, and Ghana Today. As our journey through Ghana's remarkable story approaches its conclusion, it's time to explore the stage upon which all this history has unfolded. The land itself, with its diverse geography, rich cultural tapestry, and the vibrant society that exists today. Geography, after all, is never just about rocks and rivers. It's about how the land shapes the people, and how the people, in turn, shape their relationship with the land. Ghana's geography is deceptively simple at first glance. A roughly rectangular country about the size of the United Kingdom, nestled on West Africa's Atlantic coast. But like a well-crafted piece of kente cloth, the apparent simplicity reveals intricate patterns and connections when examined closely. The country stretches from the sandy beaches of the Gulf of Guinea northward through tropical forests, rolling hills, and grassland savannas, encompassing virtually every ecological zone that West Africa has to offer. The southern coastline extends for over 500 kilometers along the Atlantic Ocean, forming a gently curving arc punctuated by rocky headlands, lagoons, and river mouths. This coast has witnessed the arrival of Portuguese explorers, the construction of European forts, the departure of slave ships, and the landing of independence leaders returning from overseas. Today, it hosts two of Ghana's most important ports, Tema and Takoradi, along with fishing villages that have been casting nets into these same waters for centuries. Moving inland from the coast, the landscape gradually rises through a series of distinct geographical regions, each with its own character and significance. The southern low plains stretch about 80 kilometers inland, encompassing the bustling Greater Accra region, where over 4 million people now live and work. This coastal savanna was once sparsely populated, but colonial administration and post-independence development have transformed it into Ghana's economic and political heart, though it often feels more like the nation's caffeinated brain during rush hour traffic. The Akan lowlands and forest zone form the next geographical band, rising gently from the coastal plains toward the interior highlands. This region has been the demographic and cultural core of Ghana for centuries, home to the majority of the country's population and the source of much of its wealth. Here, in the rich soils beneath towering forest trees, generations of farmers have cultivated cocoa, the brown gold that has sustained Ghana's economy for over a century. The irony is that most Ghanaian cocoa farmers have never tasted chocolate, since virtually all the crop is exported to feed the world's sweet tooth. At the heart of this forest region lies the Ashanti uplands, centered on the ancient city of Kumasi. This area represents something unique in African geography. A region where natural resources, cultural sophistication, and political power have coincided for over 3 centuries. The rolling hills around Kumasi contain some of the world's richest gold deposits, while Lake Bosumtwi, Ghana's only natural lake, sits in a volcanic crater like a perfectly round mirror reflecting the sky. Local legend holds that the lake is sacred to the Ashanti people, and traditional priests still perform ceremonies on its shores. The Kwahu Plateau forms a natural boundary between southern and northern Ghana, rising to heights of over 700 meters above sea level. This elevated region enjoys cooler temperatures that attracted European missionaries and colonial administrators, who established some of Ghana's most prestigious schools in these highland towns. The plateau also serves as a watershed, with rivers flowing south to the Atlantic and north toward the mighty Volta River system. The Volta Basin dominates central Ghana, covering nearly half the country's total area. This vast depression contains Lake Volta, the world's largest artificial lake by surface area, created when the Akosombo Dam was completed in 1965. The lake stretches over 500 kilometers from north to south, creating an inland sea that has fundamentally altered transportation, fishing, and agriculture in central Ghana. What was once a network of small farming communities along the Volta River became a massive resettlement project, as over 80,000 people were relocated to make way for the rising waters. Northern Ghana presents a completely different landscape, rolling grasslands and scattered trees stretching toward the borders with Burkina Faso and Togo. This savanna region experiences a markedly different climate from the humid south, with a single rainy season and a long dry period when the Harmattan winds blow dust from the Sahara Desert across the landscape. The north has historically been less densely populated and economically integrated than the south, though recent decades have seen significant development efforts aimed at reducing these disparities. Climate patterns across Ghana follow these geographical divisions closely. The south experiences 2 rainy seasons annually, supporting the lush tropical forests that have been home to diverse wildlife for millennia. Elephants, leopards, forest buffalo, and numerous species of primates once roamed freely through these forests, though habitat loss and human pressure have drastically reduced their numbers. Conservation efforts now focus on protecting remaining forest reserves and national parks, though the challenge of balancing conservation with development needs remains formidable. The cultural geography of Ghana is equally complex and fascinating. The country is home to over 70 ethnic groups, each with its own language, customs, and traditions, yet somehow managing to coexist in relative harmony. The Akan peoples, including the Ashanti, Fante, and numerous smaller groups, constitute the largest ethnic family, speaking related languages and sharing similar cultural traditions. Their influence extends far beyond their numbers, as Akan cultural practices, particularly those of the Ashanti, have become symbols of Ghanaian identity worldwide. Ashanti culture, in particular, represents one of Africa's most sophisticated traditional societies. The Ashanti developed complex political institutions, artistic traditions, and spiritual practices that continue to thrive today. The office of the Asantehene, or Ashanti King, remains one of the most powerful traditional authorities in modern Ghana, commanding respect and loyalty from millions of people. The current Asantehene, Otumfuo Osei Tutu II, lives in a palace in Kumasi and presides over elaborate ceremonies that blend ancient traditions with contemporary realities. The famous kente cloth, with its intricate geometric patterns and vibrant colours, originated among the Ashanti and has become perhaps Ghana's most recognisable cultural export. Each pattern has meaning, and master weavers spend years learning the significance of different designs and colour combinations. What was once reserved for royalty is now worn by Ghanaians living around the world as a symbol of cultural pride, though authentic, hand-woven kente remains expensive enough that many people own only a small strip for special occasions. Traditional religion remains an important part of Ghanaian culture, even as Christianity and Islam have gained prominence. The Akan religious system recognizes a supreme deity, Nyame, along with numerous lesser gods and spirits that inhabit natural features like rivers, trees, and rocks. Ancestor veneration plays a central role, as deceased family members are believed to remain active participants in the lives of their descendants. This creates a cultural continuity that links present-day Ghanaians to countless generations of their forebears. The northern regions of Ghana are home to different ethnic groups with their own rich cultural traditions. The Dagomba, Mamprusi, and Gonja peoples developed kingdoms that predate European contact and continue to maintain traditional political structures alongside modern democratic institutions. The Dagbon Kingdom, centered in Yendi, has a complex system of traditional chiefs and a royal succession that has occasionally generated conflicts requiring mediation by national authorities. Language diversity in Ghana reflects this cultural complexity. While English serves as the official language and the medium of instruction in schools, most Ghanaians speak at least one local language at home. Twi, the largest Akan language, serves as a lingua franca across much of southern Ghana, while Hausa is widely understood in the north. The government promotes multilingual education, recognizing that preserving local languages is essential for maintaining cultural identity. Contemporary Ghanaian society represents a fascinating blend of traditional and modern influences. In Accra, young professionals might start their day checking social media on smartphones, while commuting to air-conditioned offices, then spend their evening attending a traditional naming ceremony where libations are poured to honor ancestors. This cultural fluidity is one of Ghana's greatest strengths, allowing the society to adapt to global changes while maintaining strong connections to local traditions. The role of chieftaincy in modern Ghana illustrates this balance between tradition and modernity. Traditional chiefs have no official political power under the constitution, but they remain influential figures in their communities, mediating disputes, overseeing land allocation, and serving as custodians of cultural traditions. Some chiefs have become development advocates, using their traditional authority to promote education, healthcare, and economic projects in their areas. Urban Ghana presents a different set of dynamics. Accra has grown into a sprawling metropolis of over 4 million people, combining gleaming office buildings with sprawling markets, gated communities with informal settlements. It embodies both the opportunities and challenges of rapid development. Rural areas maintain a slower pace, reflecting agricultural traditions. Village life revolves around farming cycles, traditional festivals, and extended family networks. However, even remote villages now have mobile phone access, and young people migrate to cities before returning home with new ideas. Education has become a national priority, with parents making enormous sacrifices for their children's schooling. Free senior high school education has expanded access, though quality remains an ongoing concern. Ghanaian students now compete globally for university places. Religious life in contemporary Ghana is remarkably vibrant and diverse. Christianity, particularly Pentecostal churches, has experienced explosive growth, with massive church services broadcast on television. Islam is also growing, particularly in northern regions, and generally coexists peacefully with Christianity and traditional religion. The art scene reflects this cultural dynamism. Highlife music, which emerged as a fusion of traditional rhythms with Western instruments, remains popular alongside hip-hop and gospel music. Ghanaian musicians have gained international recognition, while traditional drumming and dancing continue to thrive. Food culture centers around staples like rice, yams, and plantains, often accompanied by spicy stews. Jollof rice holds a special place in Ghanaian hearts, while street food culture offers everything from kelewele to bofrot, making walking through any town an aromatic adventure. Environmental challenges loom large in contemporary Ghana. Illegal mining and pollution threaten the ecological foundation of the country's prosperity. Climate change is altering rainfall patterns, forcing farmers to adapt traditional practices. Yet Ghana's response reflects resilience and creativity, with activists, traditional authorities, and government working together on sustainable solutions. Looking at Ghana today, visitors and residents alike are struck by the palpable sense of optimism that permeates the society. Despite real challenges, unemployment, inequality, infrastructure deficits, and environmental degradation, there's a widespread belief that the country is moving in the right direction. This optimism is grounded in concrete achievements, declining poverty rates, improving health outcomes, expanding educational opportunities, and a democratic system that has proven its resilience through multiple peaceful transfers of power. Ghana's position as a beacon of democracy and stability in West Africa brings both opportunities and responsibilities. The country hosts refugees from conflicts in neighbouring states, serves as a headquarters for international organisations, and has become a destination for African Americans and others in the diaspora seeking to reconnect with their African heritage. The Year of Return initiative in 2019 brought thousands of diaspora visitors to Ghana, strengthening cultural and economic connections across the Atlantic. As we conclude our journey through Ghana's history and geography, it's worth reflecting on what makes this country so remarkable. Ghana's story is not one of perfection. It's a tale of resilience, adaptation, and the gradual construction of a society that balances tradition with modernity, diversity with unity, and local identity with global engagement. From the ancient kingdoms that controlled trans-Saharan trade routes to the modern democracy that has become a model for the continent, Ghana has consistently demonstrated that African societies can create their own paths to prosperity and freedom. The Ghana of today, with its bustling markets and quiet fishing villages, its traditional chiefs and tech entrepreneurs, its ancient forests and modern cities, represents the culmination of a remarkable historical journey. It's a country where gold miners work alongside cocoa farmers, where traditional drummers perform at the same festivals as hip-hop artists, and where the wisdom of ancestors is consulted alongside the latest scientific research. As you drift off to sleep, perhaps you can imagine the gentle rhythm of waves on Ghana's Atlantic coast, the rustle of wind through the forest canopy, or the distant sound of drums echoing across Lake Volta under a star-filled sky. Ghana's story continues to unfold, written by millions of people who carry forward the dreams of their ancestors while building new possibilities for future generations. And in that ongoing story, there's both a profound sense of continuity with the past and an endless possibility for the future, much like the eternal rhythm of the tides that have washed Ghana's shores for countless centuries, promising that tomorrow will bring new opportunities, new challenges, and new chapters in this remarkable nation's continuing saga.